Well, let's get started. Again, thank you all for joining the Clean Cities webinar series. Today, the Electric Vehicle How-To Series, Part 1, Preparing for Your Electric Transition. Next slide, please. Wonderful. This is our agenda for today. We'll begin with an introduction, and I'll introduce our panelists, the Clean Cities overview, and our speakers. We have Sarah Booth, leveraging data to inform fleet transitions. We have Rick Durst, considering when planning your infrastructure. And finally, we'll have Randall Kaufman, the importance of talking to your utility. And then we'll wrap up with a question and answer period hosted by Michael Graham of Willamette Clean Cities. Also, please use your chat box to ask questions. We'll gather those up and process those at the end of the webinar. Next slide, please. All right, just a little bit of housekeeping. You are welcome to chat with others in your attendee box, or you can send them out to everyone, or you can choose a particular attendee. Also, ask questions using the questions box again. Feel free to lodge your questions during the presentation, and we'll answer those again with the question and answer section. So we're excited to get some feedback and answer some questions for you with our panelists and other folks that are on the call and webinar. The webinar recording will be available to all those who are in attendance today, and we'll send that out and notify you when those are available to you to look at. Next slide, please. And again, we would like to welcome our today's speaker. We have Sarah Booth. She's the Chief Operating Officer for SciWatch Labs. And we have Rick Durst, who's the owner of Durst Energy and a board member of Columbia Willamette Clean Cities Coalition. And then we have Randall Kaufman, who's the Sales Director of Black & Veatch. Welcome to our esteemed panelists today. Next slide, please. I wanted to give you a little bit of a Clean Cities overview. We like to do this because this is a Clean Cities webinar series, and we want to share with you the importance of working with your local Clean Cities and the resources that we have available today to assist you with your fleet transportation needs today and for tomorrow. Next slide, please. The Clean Cities Coalition models consist of local coalitions fostering change in their communities with the help of federal resources and expertise. We're very excited to be part of over 90 Clean Cities coalitions, and we're very excited to have you with us today as we show you a little bit more about the work that we do. Again, next slide. There are no perfect fuels, and there are over 12 fuels that the Clean Cities Coalitions work with. And so we always like to say we use common sense solutions. And so we look at your needs, your duty cycle, your funding, your availability of the fuels that we offer. And then we also would like to look at the opportunities to solve and have solutions for those opportunities with your fleets. Next slide, please. And again, as I mentioned, we have over 12 mature fuels that we work with. Primarily along our corridors, we work with biodiesel, electricity, ethanol, hydrogen, natural gas, and propane or autogas. And again, we'd like to also say we'd like to have a choice at the pump. And along our corridors, which are the alternative corridors that go across our nation, those fuels are available to you in different varieties. And we're always looking for stakeholders who are interested in building out the new and advanced fuels of today. Fantastic. So the next thing I'd like to talk to you about is our legislative and policy review. We have federal and state funding opportunities that are available to you through the Department of Energy. We also have EPA grants, which are the DERA grants, and we also have CMAQ money. We also work really hard to make sure that tax incentives and other programs are available to help assist you with your fleet and infrastructure needs. These are incentives. We also work locally and on a federal level to ensure that laws and regulations best meet our needs as we advance these alternative fuels into the future. There are grants, there's funding opportunities. Again, reach out to your Clean Cities Network folks and see what's available, and we're very happy to consult with you and see what we can do to assist you with your transportation needs. Next slide, please. One of our great opportunities that we like to share is that you can look at this Alternative Fuels Data Center. This is a portal of tremendous information. It has case studies, it has fueling options, there are the laws and incentives are there, your fuel economies, you can compare vehicles side by side, you can see the latest and greatest technology information all in one location. There are maps, data, tools, widgets for your website. So this again is a fantastic wealth of resources that we love to share with our stakeholders and members, and we certainly are happy to help you navigate this site. And again, you can see that's the AFDC energy government stations. And this station is a piece where you can see where the infrastructure. So today, for example, we're talking about electricity. This gives you an opportunity to see where electric opportunities are available, and also along our corridors where we need your support and help to fill those gaps so we can ensure that we have a seamless alternative fuels corridor across our nation, within your region, and in your state. Next slide, please. So again, as we go along today and you listen to our three speakers, please put your questions into the chat box, and we'll be collecting those and processing those at the end of the webinar. Next slide, please. I'd like to welcome Sarah Booth. She has a wonderful presentation for you. So Sarah, welcome to our Clean Cities webinar, and thank you for your time today. Take it away.
Tammy, thank you so much for that introduction. I really appreciate it. And hopefully, can you see my screen, Tammy?
Yes, we can, Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you, Tammy. Appreciate it. Thanks, Brian. First, I wanted to say thank you to the Clean City Coalitions for inviting me to participate. I have been in the clean tech sector, primarily supporting local and state governments for more than a decade now, and many of the resources that Tammy mentioned, like the ASBC, I've used those as long as that. So I really do encourage you to check those out. Clean Cities Coalitions have been doing a great job providing resources all across the board for clean fuels and clean technologies to cities all across the country. So I'm here to talk about how you get started and how you really expand your EV strategy and doing it in a data-driven fashion. Here at Sawatch Labs, that's exactly what we focus on. We are a data analytics firm and data nerds, self-proclaimed data nerds. We really enjoy looking at what's going on with how the vehicles are driven in a fleet. And we help fleets look at sustainability all the way from doing utilization analyses and right-sizing a fleet to identifying EV candidates, which ones are the best fit, and that's really what I'm going to focus on here, kind of to helping identify where charging infrastructure would be best situated to support those vehicles, as well as managing and optimizing those EVs once they're in your fleet. And we are based in Colorado and California. We have worked with fleets from very small fleets that have about 30 vehicles all the way up to working with whole state fleets. We've analyzed as few as 5 vehicles in a fleet all the way up to 2,500. And the reason we're able to do this and to do this quickly is because we rely on that telematics data. I'm going to jump a little bit into what telematics data is in a moment, but what that data allows us to do is to do that analysis quickly and understanding exactly how those vehicles are driven. We've worked with fleets in about 20 different states, and primarily we support local governments and state governments. So we work a lot with public sector fleets and kind of understand how the operations differ there from private sector fleets. When we got started, and this is kind of one of our internal mottos, we like to say all miles are not equal. And the reason that this is really important, especially with electric vehicles, is because the types of miles that vehicle is driven impact the energy demand on that battery. And so this is an example from a fleet vehicle, a state fleet vehicle that we analyzed. And I like to call out this one vehicle here. So you'll see, or one day here. So you'll see these green bars or turquoise bars. That represents the vehicle miles traveled in that specific day. So these are all different days. I'm going to call you to this one right here with the blue lightning bolt. Now what the lightning bolt identifies is how much energy that vehicle would need to complete all of its driving. So you can see really clearly with this one, the vehicle miles traveled that day, they fall well within the range of that leaf. And this is a standard leaf. But the energy demand for this vehicle actually approaches the range of that bolt. And so understanding what types of miles is really integral to understanding whether or not your vehicle could be replaced with an electric vehicle or what electric vehicle model will be the best fit. And this is incredibly important when you're talking to your drivers, right? Big things that impact this difference are, is it highway speed? Is it stop and go? Another thing we see on reverse is you see a lot of fuel use in internal combustion engine vehicles when they're idling a lot. So you might look at a vehicle that has an annual VMT of just 1,000 miles and think, no way an electric vehicle makes sense. But then when you dive into how that vehicle is actually driven and you understand that maybe this vehicle idles all the time, you might actually have substantial savings in an EV. And we see this across fleets all the time, and it's always a bit of a shocker to the fleet managers. And I'm going to go down and dive a little bit more into this. A mile is not a mile. And this is why we use telematics. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with telematics, but that's a little device that is plugged into the OBD2 port on a vehicle, and it provides all kinds of data, more than you might need. But some of the important data that we use off of that is a GPS trace and then some other engine diagnostics. And that allows us to understand not just what the vehicle's doing, on an annual basis, but really what it's doing on a day-to-day basis. And one of the reasons this is so critical is that it helps you understand, will the EV meet your driver's needs? We all know that as a fleet manager, that is your number one goal. You have to make sure that these vehicles are supporting your drivers. And range anxiety is a big issue. And so understanding how every single day, how that driver drove their existing vehicle and what that energy demand would be helps you understand very specifically if an EV or which EV would be the best fit. And this really addresses that range anxiety. A lot of the fleets we work with say, oh, we really like having this data because now we can talk to each individual driver and say, hey, based on all your driving over the 90 days or the 12 months that we analyzed, you never would have needed to charge midday to do the rest of your driving if you replace your vehicle with a leaf, for example. Or we really need to give you a bolt because you do have a number of days where you exceed the range of that leaf. But having this discussion with the data behind it really gives those drivers the understanding that you're not just saying, here's an EV, take an EV, charge whenever you can. Another thing, and you can't get this from the telematics data, you really need it from the drivers and the managers, is what are the vehicles being used for, right? Do you have capacity requirements? They're always moving a lot of people around or a lot of cargo around. So, it's really important to figure out what your driver's needs are to see if there is an EV that meets the needs of that outside of the driving needs. And then another one that I really like, this one is definitely on the fun data nerd side, is four-wheel drive. I'm sure you all hear this all the time. Hey, my drivers need to have a four-wheel drive vehicle. You can't give them an EV. Well, one of the things that we can do with that telematics data is we can look at every mile that vehicle drove. And then we can overlay it with data on the surface of the roads that those miles were driven on. And then we can identify how many miles or how many trips did these vehicles take where they spent any time on an unpaved surface. And then that helps you understand, yeah, maybe some of those drivers really do need four-wheel drive, or maybe they're going off-road 1% of their trips. And maybe they're only going a half a mile each time, or maybe they're going even less than that. It just helps you have a better conversation with your drivers about, what the needs are and whether or not an EV would be a good fit. So moving on from that operational fit, we we like to talk about then, okay, now if it's a good fit operationally, let's look at it economically. And this comes down to looking at the operational cost of the vehicle and comparing it in an EV versus your base ICE option, which vehicle you have available to you that you might replace the existing vehicle with. And that looks at mostly fuel use. That's really driving the operational costs. But you also have other things like electricity costs, maintenance costs. Maintenance costs are much lower for an EV in general, and it's worth understanding what that difference is because it can be pretty substantial. And it's also important to look at how you're doing that comparison, if it's on a per mile basis or if it's on an annual basis, and what makes the most sense for that maintenance that you're doing. And then also the upfront costs of the vehicles, but we look at that separately. So first we do the operational assessment so you can understand year to year what that difference would be, and then the full total cost of ownership analysis to say, okay, if I replace this vehicle with an EV, will I save money over the lifetime of my vehicle or not? And that's obviously really, really important. Then the last thing is we run sensitivity analysis, and I would encourage you to do the same when you're looking at any type of economic analysis with an EV. There are a lot of variables that can change, vehicle price being one of them, but a big, in all of the sensitivity analyses we've done, one of the big drivers that changes whether or not a vehicle is a good fit is gas prices. And gas prices can be extremely variable and fluctuate year over year. Electricity rates, they're pretty stable. They change very slowly. So we have only found just a handful of vehicles that change in the electricity rate really impacted whether or not they were a good fit. That's really that fuel cost you want to keep an eye on. So the next thing then, okay, the vehicle's a good fit operationally, the vehicle's a good fit economically. Let's talk about where do I install chargers? Now, every single time we do this analysis, we have vehicles where the fleet manager thinks that they park at the same place every single night, and we find vehicles that don't. So we really look at that overnight parking and those opportunities to charge for a long period. With that telematics data, you can pull out, I'm getting a Zoom connect. I wonder if I lost you guys. Let's see. Sammy, can you guys see everything? Okay, great.
I don't see the slides.
Can you still see my, let's give it another share and see. Okay, we'll keep rocking. If not, I can do without
Nailed
the slides. Thanks. So what you can do with that telematics data is you can really see everywhere this vehicle parks. And what that helps you understand is where would it need to be charging? Where would you need to have charging infrastructure? So this example here, this vehicle parks 60% of the time at its primary location. That's the top row in that table. But then it parks 40% of the time at 2 other locations. So if this vehicle only had charging access at that first location, it probably wouldn't be smart to put an EV in this application because it wouldn't have access to charging on many nights, on 40% of the nights. And so going into this really helps you figure out where do I need charging infrastructure to support these vehicles? And then also, are there opportunities where these vehicles can start sharing charging infrastructure at the same location, but also on those nights that they park at other locations? So this parking data is extremely rich with telematics and really, really helpful. And hopefully, you'll get a little bit more of that detail when Rick presents next on, how to plan charging infrastructure. And then the last thing that we're hearing a lot about now is really what's the impact on my demand charge? We're seeing fleet managers are being forced to become experts in electric utility rates, how things vary for time of day rates or across different seasons. And initially, almost always you put 1, 2 vehicles in, it's likely not going to impact your demand charge, but it is 100% worth making sure that you understand that. And so we're working on a project with the National Renewable Energy Lab right now, looking at just this across many fleets and identifying when are all the vehicles coming back at the end of the day, when would they charge? So assuming they plug in right when the driver gets back, how does that charging all overlap at different levels of deployment? If you have 5% EVs, what does that look like? Now, if you bump it up to 10%, what does that impact look like? So that you can understand when you really need to be concerned about that, changing the demand charge and changing the peak demand at your facility where they're charging, as well as looking at opportunities to do smart charging and manage charging to really spread that out so it's not all occurring at the same time. And so this is one of our tools. This is how we roll up all of that data. It's our Easy EV tool. And what I really like about this, and hopefully it's helpful for you when you're having conversations with different stakeholders in your organization, is that breaking out these metrics for us, we've found it to be really helpful for talking with those different stakeholders, because you can touch on all the components that matter most to them. So we have an overall Easy EV score. Is it a good fit or not? In this case, the sample vehicle, yes, it is. You could replace it with this Nissan Leaf. The confidence score is really, do we have enough data? Have we seen at least 90 days of how this vehicle is driven? The energy score, that touches to the operational component. And this again goes to how you can have that conversation with your drivers. For this example, 95% of the days this driver would only need to charge at night when they got back to the lot. But now you would have to ask your driver and hope your driver would be comfortable with this, or at least have a discussion about it. 5% of the nights, 5% of the days that this vehicle is driven, they would need to find midday charging to complete the rest of their trips. And so this really helps open up that conversation and helps fleet managers understand what their comfort level is, and if they really want 100% charging to only happen at night, or if they're expecting drivers to charge, do opportunity charges during the middle of the day. And then this one's kind of a boring score on the economics. It's 100, but this one is actually showing then that there's savings over the lifetime. You know, this really helps when you're talking to your procurement officials or your finance department. You can say, look, over 8 years, we know this vehicle costs more, but over 8 years, in this example, we'd have about 15% savings, which is excellent. And then the parking one. And this is really a good conversation with your fleet staff, your facilities managers. Hey, where are we going to have to install infrastructure? What does that look like? And, you know, kind of lead you toward that next step of site assessments. And then the other thing here is the metrics on greenhouse gas emissions reductions. You know, that we find to be really useful for discussions with sustainability stakeholders. And then one thing that I really like to highlight is once you do the data-driven analysis and planning up front, please don't drop that once you get EVs in the fleet. You know, make sure you're looking at how are the EVs performing? Are they performing the way you expect them to? And by performing, that usually means, are your drivers driving the vehicles and are they plugging them in? This example is a state fleet manager came to us and said, all of my PHEVs, I just have an inkling, they're not being plugged in at night. And so we looked at about 6 months of data, and that fleet manager was correct. On less than 10% of the nights that they were parked at their home location were these vehicles being plugged in. And so they, you know, had an education campaign, talked with their drivers, and almost immediately were able to nearly double that rate. But still, you know, between 15 and 20%, it's not a lot of nights to be plugging in those PHEVs. And unless you're plugging them in, you're not getting all those economic and environmental savings that you were anticipating to receive. So please, please continue to manage those vehicles. Use that data. It'll help you get the savings that you expected. And that's really kind of the underlying thing of what we do is, you know, use that data. It really helps you understand what's going on and helps you take action and feel very confident and have those discussions with your stakeholders to bring everybody on board so that everything works as you anticipated. Thank you everyone so much. Tammy, I think I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Wonderful. Sarah, thank you so much for sharing that great fleet information. And we appreciate your thoughtfulness on helping us look at EVs as a fantastic adoption piece for fleets, and we're really excited to take a deeper dive in that. So again, thank you so much for your information. Next up, we have Rick Durst, who's the owner of Durst Energy. And we're very excited to hear from Rick today. He's also a board member of the Columbia Willamette Clean Cities. So welcome, Rick, and take it away.
All right, thank you very much for the introduction, Tammy, and thanks, Sarah, for that good presentation. There's a lot of things that will feed into what people need to do when they're starting to evaluate their charging infrastructure. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide here. All right, so I use this, if you build it, they will come. Most people remember that from the Field of Dreams, but actually it was first said to know about building the ark. And in the early days of charger installation, that's kind of how we felt, is like, well, who's going to use these things? And with installations like at the Electric Avenue at Portland State University, and then the future Electric Avenue that we did at World Trade Center in Portland, there was really a place for people to congregate, and there was lots more charging needed since those times. And one of the main things is when you're doing any renovation work, especially if you're doing a project that's building, bringing power out to a parking lot or a parking garage, just always plan for future power needs and put in extra conduit. And it's really important because you don't want to have to come back and dig that stuff up. So anytime you're doing any type of EV charging project, always try to think ahead, because when you're starting a fleet and you say, oh, well, I'm just going to put 2 chargers in for right now, and then with the data that you get, you're going to start getting people to realize that EVs do meet a lot of people's needs, and they're easier to use and less maintenance and all the savings that Sarah was just talking about. But you're going to want to add more later. So it's just, when you're adding extra things, put in extra conduit. If you're doing any projects, like I said, that have to do with bringing power outside the building at all. And in some cases, maybe you just need to put in a new service, and they'll talk more about, utility stuff a little bit later. So as I was talking about for the EV projects, the other thing to do is, if you put in more conduit, put a junction box kind of at the end of the last charger, kind of stubbed up for future expansion. So you can easily add more. As far as the equipment, we'll talk a little bit more about that, but you want to look at the power needs and the charging speeds and stuff. And that's kind of what Sarah was talking about. If you did a good analysis with your fleet, you'd know what you need to do. And whatever you can get for cars now, the batteries are just going to get bigger, and cars will be able to charge faster. And so you want to think about that as well. There are some cases, if you look at the data and the way your fleet is driven, that you may not even need faster charging. So you could still meet most of those needs anyway. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So power levels, again, this is trying to evaluate, how fast you need to restore the full charge on that vehicle, and that relies on that vehicle usage data. Most cars will be able to charge up at level 2 using 40 to 100 amp circuit, and that's going to depend on the vehicle. There's, if you get a plug-in hybrid, which is kind of a transition in between, a fully electric vehicle, then a lot of those will be able to charge up on, probably about a 20 amp circuit is all they would need. But there's not much of a cost difference between a 20 and a 40 amp circuit. So starting with a minimum of 40 amp circuit would be, cost effective early on, especially when you change to fully electric vehicles. One of the big things about the infrastructure considerations that we're going to talk about is a lot of it's going to depend on who are you building this for. If it's just for fleets, or if it's for employees or customers, you're going to have different answers for these questions. And it may be a mix of things, because you may have some, on the fleet side, you may put some out in a parking lot for employees, and you may have other spots for customers, but mainly for fleets, what we're talking about here, you're going to try to figure out about payment mechanisms and controls. Do you need any of those? So in some cases, you may use a fleet pay card and you want to track all your energy used at your fleet. And so there are some charging stations that would be able to use that fleet pay card. A lot of them will have their own swipe card. And if you get a charger that has payment mechanisms and controls, then you would be able to track the energy used by that swipe card, and you could have that on the key ring of the car. So you could always get that data about which car was charging up, and especially if you charged up in different places. So the car may come back and you may have lots of different charging spots, and they could just park in those locations. And you don't necessarily have to have it assigned to a specific car if you had a swipe card, if you wanted to track the information. There are different types of other access controls. Maybe you want it to fit with a badge that you have for your fleets. For getting in and out of your building, you may want to have a key lock. You may want people to use just a smartphone, or again, like I mentioned, a fleet pay card. So there's a bunch of different options there for payment mechanisms and controls. As far as metering goes, if you do have something that has payment mechanisms, then you don't necessarily need to sub-meter those charging stations, because you'll typically have all that information associated with the chargers themselves, through the payment controls and the networking. But if you don't, you want to make sure you have some type of metering in there, whether it's a utility meter, whether you put in a sub-meter, you interface it with your building, all those types of things, because somebody's going to ask the question, well, how much are we using for those charging stations? And it's a really good idea to make sure you have that built in. If you add that on later, it's going to cost you twice as much, for the equipment, and then having somebody connect that back up to something, if you're doing it after you've already built the charging station infrastructure out there. The other thing is you might want to be able to do load control with the building. One thing that Sarah mentioned was the charging stations. She's looking at the usage patterns of when people come back. And if you have everybody coming back at night and everybody plugging in at once, you want to be able to do some load control on that to reduce your peak demands that may come in all at the same time. You may not need that if you find out that people are coming in and out all during the day, people are plugging in at different times, and the cars are able to recharge when they need to. I'm not sure about other states, but I know I said Oregon and Washington here. I meant Oregon and California, so I should change that slide there. Oregon and I was probably doing it in hopes that Washington would finally pass their laws on to clean fuels credits. So that's probably what it is. But anyway, Oregon and California both have clean fuels credits, and other states may follow suit. And having that metering in there either through a sub-meter, so you're be able to track those charging stations, or using the networking capabilities of your payment mechanism, having that information is really important. So as far as usage tracking, again, that could be just using the energy, but also having a network system is important if you want to see, well, how many uses does each charger get, the number of users that are using it, how much energy was used, the fleet tracking. Again, that kind of ties back to a fleet card or having an RFID card. And again, the clean fuels credits. But there's more than just, the energy uses there, especially if you're doing something that is going to be for employees or customers. You may want to see how often people are plugged in, and you can tell that with the charging network system to see how many people are plugged in at one time, when their charge got done, how long they sat there while they weren't charging, kind of they're occupying the space time, not actively charging. And then another thing to think about is cord management. There's a lot of different options. You can just have a little reel that you just wrap it around. It could be wireless chargers. There could be, you want to make sure you have a connector for the holder to take the connector and plug it into something so it doesn't just fall on the ground all the time. And then there could be overhead management, especially if you have a big open bay kind of parking and you have some trucks or something like that, or buses. You may want to have something that's overhead that you can pull down and connect into the vehicle, so you don't have charging stations kind of in the way of parking areas. And then there's some that will self-retract. You can, be done charging and it'll pull itself back in. Let's go to the next slide, please. So this slide is really controversial for some people. And I want you to first of all notice the installation costs over there. And it's gray, and its reason is because it's a big gray area. It really depends on your particular situation. These installation costs are ones that we have done here in Oregon and Washington for charging installations that we've been involved in or have either done ourselves or have known about that other people have done. And so the levels of the charger is the level 2 charger, 40 amp charger, no payment mechanism, metering control. Costs are typically $400 to $700 for a single port mounted on the wall. You add, either a single port or dual port that has a payment mechanism and other controls with it, then that increases. And then quick charging, there's a number of different categories that I broke things down into here for that. But again, the installation of these, we've done some installations for level 2 charging that have been, $500 or $600. But again, we've also done some that are about $12,000 to $15,000. But I kind of have these ranges in here as kind of typical things that we've experienced, but there's all sorts of things that can really make that change. I'm just trying to give this kind of as a guideline, even though I say at the bottom, don't use it as quotes or even a guideline. Utility costs aren't included here. If you're going further across a parking lot or through a building or have to upgrade utility, or not just utilities, but upgrade other things in the building to be able to make capacity, those aren't in here. So there's a lot of different things that have to be considered when you're looking about the cost of the chargers and the installations. Let's go ahead to the next slide. So the charging connector types, this is getting easier and easier. Down on the bottom right is the standard connector that is used for level 1 or level 2 charging for all modern day US vehicles. If you have some cars from the 90s, then that may be different, but all cars will be able to use this connector and plug in and charge up. If you have a Tesla, like is shown on the bottom left down there, you'll need to have an adapter that either comes with your Tesla, depending upon which model you buy or when you buy it, or it's a $95 add-on that you buy a little adapter that will adapt to the J1772 vehicle. So Teslas can all charge up using that with an adapter made by Tesla. And so with that bottom right connector, you should be able to charge up all your cars. Now, if you want to charge up faster, or you have a truck or other heavier duty vehicle, buses, there could be other connector options that you can use. And those will be specific to those manufacturers. There's about 3 or 4 different ones that are using them. But also that J1772 higher connector can actually do higher power for level 2 charging up to about 80 amps on that connector. And so you can still charge up, a typical bus, overnight. So the top 2 connectors are ones that can do quick charging. And the one on the left is a combined charging system, or CCS, SA combo charger connector. And most of the vendors are using that. Nissan is in transition to that. They say their newer cars are going to have that. And then that kind of makes obsolete the top right one, which is the CHAdeMO connector that Nissan, Kia, and Mitsubishi used. So those are typically a little bit older vehicles where most of the other ones are transitioning over to the CCS charger. Let's go ahead to the next slide. This slide here, this is, wants you to think about ADA concerns in EV charging. These are some guidelines, and there's a link to that guideline there. There's no common national guideline that says this is what you have to do. Most of the different ones that are either different states or could be cities or counties may have their own specific requirements. You want to think about this, and there's a lot of things when you're putting in a charger, you may think about, well, am I going to put in wheel stops? Am I going to put in bollards? And all those things are kind of impediments to somebody that has ADA accessibility needs, either navigating over wheel stops or around bollards or getting a cord and being able to, you know, pull it across the top of their car and things like that. So locating the charging station with some of these guidelines is going to be really important. And in the future, there may be more information about this that's going to come out, and maybe there'll be some national guidelines. But you want to make sure that you're thinking about that, because if your city or state has a requirement for that, then you want to make sure you're following that. If it doesn't have a requirement for it, but you still want to be thinking about that accessibility, and if you're putting something new in there, there's no reason not to plan on having at least one of those charging stations or a number of them that are ADA accessible. Let's go to the next slide. This is the last thing. I'm not going to go through all this, but this is kind of our highlights for our company and things that we've worked on and what we've done and kind of our accomplishments. And so we kind of work with people to help them with all these decisions that they have to make about the installation, what they need, where they need it, what type of chargers they need, and kind of selection on that. And I'm going to pass that back to Tammy, I guess. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rick. And next we have Randall Kaufman. He's the sales director of Black & Veatch, and we're excited to see what Randall has to share with us today. Thank you, Randall, and take it away.
Thank you very much, Tammy. Thank you very much to all the attendees with your attention today. And thanks to my panelists for their excellent coverage of what you're going to find is the first two key items for our planning for EV infrastructure. And that is exactly what Sarah mentioned Sawatch does, and Rick with Durst. Next slide, please. So a little bit about Black & Veatch. We're a global engineering, procurement, construction company. I've been around for over 100 years, consistently ranking at the top of the industry. We're very proud of all of the recognition, but especially our safety record, which is the best in the industry, and our commitment to diversity. Next slide, please. So our focus is on critical human infrastructure. So this includes, the founding of our company was around water. Then we've got into power. We've built hydroelectric dams, power plants, power distribution, all, much of the utilities in US are clients of ours and have been. We're involved with oil and gas, including renewable natural gas and hydrogen. For telecommunications, we've built out quite a bit of the nation's cellular infrastructure. And really relevant to today's discussion is we have a practice for clean transportation, electric vehicle charging, hydrogen fueling. Next slide, please. So what we do is pretty much the entire turnkey program for planning and installation of everything that we do, strategy and planning, site acquisition, land services, including the ADA, which Rick mentioned. And really the meat of it is the consulting, design, engineering, construction. The permitting is a real big factor, which I'll get into a little bit. And next slide, please. So with regards to electric vehicle charging, we have recently published a guideline, the 8 steps. And as I mentioned, and my colleagues on the panel have, the first 2-3 steps are really important for understanding the use case and the future, what types of vehicles, how many at each location, all the strategy that have been previously discussed. Then we really get into the site planning and what's the strategy for implementing the infrastructure to support the charging needs now and the future. Next slide, please. So what we find, especially now, is as the fleets are growing, the vehicles are, as Rick mentioned, larger batteries. What happens is the amount of power available at the site for charging is insufficient for, in some cases, the future. I mean, in some cases, the present, but definitely for future charging needs. So what happens is we immediately get into a situation where we need to plan with the utility for additional power at the site. And then also, this is really important to start considering what kind of distributed generation and energy storage assets might be prudent for future, as well as resiliency to ensure the availability of electricity should there be an outage on the grid. Next slide, please. So as both Sarah and Rick mentioned, the stakeholder alignment is really important. There could be a variety of different applications, a variety of different vehicles, a variety of different needs. So getting all the stakeholders and finding the commonalities is really important for planning, especially when considering resilience, the ongoing cost of energy, the future-proofing the infrastructure, as well as timelines and budgets, as I'll get into a little bit, and Rick has touched on, sometimes it's, the initial deployment with certain vehicles and on-site charging is good for now, but how do you scale up for the future? And a lot of that depends on what kind of utility power is needed and when it will be available. Next slide, please. So for those of you who are new for this, it's an exciting opportunity and a great challenge. Electricity is the new fuel. So understanding where that electricity comes from and where it's usable for EV charging is really important. So and I'll touch on this just very lightly for now. It's a longer discussion, but starting at the use at the building or at the EV charging is typically a low voltage or a 480 volt connection. But depending on the size of the fleet and the amount of power needed, oftentimes the utility needs to deliver a new transformer. For larger fleets and large transits, then they will need to deliver a new circuit. And in some cases, and we're starting to see this already, a new substation. So depending on what the needs are for the site and ultimately for the fleet, the expansion of this utility service takes time. And I'll get into that in a little bit. Next slide, please. So to give an idea of what that means is for ports, and Rick touched on this great, and I think the Electric Avenue is a great example there, whoever visited that in Portland. Depending on how many ports there are, this is just a rough, rough estimate of what kind of power expansion is needed. But in this example, assuming 125 kW per charger, this equates to a certain amount of megawatts. And then depending on how many megawatts you need at the site, this is a general guide to consider what kind of new utility service would be needed. So this is showing 2 megawatts. Generally, you might be okay. That's equivalent to maybe a 3,000 amp 480 volt service. But when you get above that, then almost every time you're going to need a new transformer. And so depending on, and next slide, please. Depending on what service is needed, there's a certain amount of schedule impact and time for the utility to deliver that. This shows, again, just an estimate. Oftentimes, if it's just a new switchgear, it could be 3 to 6 months. If you need a new transformer, maybe 6 to 9 months. If you need a new substation, it's going to be a couple of years, most likely, at least. Next slide, please. So a strategy to electrify, considering the amount of time to get in a utility, is we call it pilot while planning for scale. This means whatever energy you have existing on site, utilize that for your first deployment of EVs, test out the use cases, as Sarah mentioned, get an understanding of vehicles, what size batteries you're going to need, where your charging is going to occur. I mean, colleagues set this up excellent on this panel to have this this discussion. So that's the first stage, is that initial vehicles with the power you have. Then the next stage would be, okay, increasing that. And this is really important to consider what kind of resiliency and what kind of on-site generation might be utilized and you can deploy those resources sometimes faster than the utility service. So it's a great way to for your electric fleet. Next slide, please. And then Rick touched on this, and so I'll go over real quickly. We want to leave some time for questions, but there's a lot of considerations for the site, especially also as you deploy and as the utility is available. Making sure that when you do trenching and put an electrical conduit, you provide extra capacity for future growth. But there's other things too. What are the parking lot requirements? Sometimes there's a certain zoning, like a certain facilities need an amount of parking available. So there's a lot of different requirements that have to be considered. Next slide, please. And further on that, Rick mentioned ADA, that comes up a lot, but there's other things. Lighting, a lot of people overlook lighting, but depending on where the location of the chargers, you need extra lighting so at nighttime people can find their way around and have a safe environment. Also, things that come up are any landscaping. I know it's soft, but it comes up and it does oftentimes delay the project or result in extra costs. Next slide, please. So lessons learned, number one, change and risk are expensive. So do as much upfront planning as possible, as my colleagues had presented. The other thing is timing with delivery of vehicles. We've had situations where the vehicles arrive before the infrastructure is in place and they can't charge them, so they're sitting there. That's not a fun place to be. And then, of course, there's always this is so new for so many jurisdictions that a lot of times they don't really know how to handle this. So things take longer to get through the process. So be patient, stay diligent, start early, check all your boxes, double check, make sure your stakeholders are aligned and informed all the way along the way. Next slide, please. And that's the end of my presentation. We'll open it up for questions. Thank you all very much.
Wonderful. Thank you again to all of our panelists, Sarah, Rick, and Randall. Excellent information. And again, additionally, please check out your Clean Cities Alternative Fuels Data Center. There's a lot of great information to give you a foundational piece. And certainly we'll be giving you the opportunity to reach out to all of our panelists if you have additional questions or would like to contact them directly with one of your projects. So I'm going to turn the time over now to Michael Graham. Michael Graham, I know that we've collected a few questions and we are excited to hear what those are, and I'm looking forward to hearing what our panelists have to say. Thank you.
Thanks again, Tammy. Thanks again to our panelists. That was a great presentation, or series of presentations, very informative. I've got one question here coming back to Sarah at Sawatch. Phil wants to know if road data can be collected by telematics, and that includes bad weather conditions, so that fleets can understand whether they would need four-wheel drive. Just from your experience with working with different telematics systems, I guess, is that something that can be collected?
Each telematics provider provides different types of information with their devices, and some bring in other data sets and marry that in. We work with telematics providers, all telematics providers, and we see a big variance there. What we do is we bring in open source data related to weather, related to road surface, and other things like that, because right now we found that's the best way to have accurate data across all telematics providers. And it just depends on which telematics provider you're using. Ask that question, see what they have and what else they're marrying in with their telematics data.
Very cool. A follow-up to that question, do you have any idea of maybe a couple tricks for fleets that are looking at doing telematics? For instance, if you're going to install it, I mean, have you seen some bad experiences where fleets maybe try to install it themselves and you don't collect good data?
Usually fleet staff are perfectly capable of installing the device. They're pretty simple to install. You have a harness, you have the device, make sure you zip tie it really tightly. What you don't want to do, and this is where we do see issues, is one, you don't want the device to come loose. So usually there's about 3 or 4 zip ties you use when you're doing installs. just to secure everything. And then you also want to make sure you're installing it up out of the way, so it's not a hassle for drivers. Usually that means it's tucked up underneath the dashboard. And then also you want to make sure when you do that, when you tuck it up underneath the dashboard, you're using those zip ties or something else to really secure it in place, because if that device is moving side to side, up and down as the vehicle's driving, that looks like potentially erratic driving behavior, and that sways that data. So really just make sure you secure it in really tight. But in general, every fleet we've worked with, if they want to install it themselves, their staff is excellent at doing that.
One more question. Do you ever tell fleets maybe don't tell your drivers that the telematics are included so that they are more likely to drive normally?
We have that discussion. I wouldn't say we say it in exactly that way, but it is something that always comes up. You're trying to get data on how the vehicles are driving in their normal way of driving, right? We do talk a lot about how what we're using for this analysis is we're not tracking those drivers, we're tracking those vehicles, right? So we're trying to figure out how those vehicles are being driven. It's really up to fleets. Sometimes we see fleet managers who really want to tell everyone, hey, your vehicle's being included in this analysis, you'll have a device on your vehicle. And then others, when they say, you know, maybe we're gonna do 100 vehicles, FYI drivers, we're not gonna say which vehicles we're doing, we're trying to get an understanding of how vehicles are driving on their own. So it's really up to fleets on how they want to communicate that.
Very cool. Thank you. Randall, I've got a question for you. Looking at demand charges, I mean, how bad have you seen it?
Yeah.
And you know, what are some ways in the planning phases and working with the utility that fleets can mitigate those?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And as Sarah and I believe Rick both mentioned, I mean, the number one thing to do is using software and energy management. That's probably the least expensive way. And that's generally energy management is a core requirement anyway for this. So that's where to start. Then, you know, the utilities are coming up with new tariff structures. SCE right now is a program where they've waived demand charges for a few years. But we don't know what's going to happen after that. So, so work with utilities and see what kind of rates they have for EVs. And then finally, the next thing is battery energy storage, which again, going to resiliency, there's a way to value stack it where, you know, demand charge is one value the batteries provide, but then if you start tying in resiliency and other grid services, you can get more value out of the batteries. But those are the three things, the energy management, getting on the right rate tariff, and then battery energy storage.
Very cool. Thank you. And then on that resiliency note, I mean, some fleets are asking, what are some ways that folks can justify that maybe to management or leadership, whether it's dollars and cents, or obviously the redundancy and demand charges? What's some advice from you on how to justify that expenditure or investment?
Yeah, so there's a variety of ways, and in my background before doing this, I've been in the mission critical power and data center industry. So when I started that, I remember I was at the very end of using calculators to calculate the cost of downtime when selling UPS systems. It became pretty clear that there was value to that. So really it depends on the operation. So I like to use the example of a transit agency and the different schedules for the public transit, depending on if it's a rush hour schedule, a nighttime schedule, a weekend schedule, and the holiday schedule. So in that scenario, the holiday set schedule is like the bare minimum. You know, you're going to get one bus every 2 hours. That's the minimum operation on, you know, Christmas Day, whatever it is. So I think of resiliency in the same thing. Depending on the business operation, what is the absolute bare minimum you need to operate? And then that's where I would start with putting in the right amount of power, on-site generation, battery storage, whatever it is, to be able to support that. That way, you know, regardless of the grid, you've got this minimum level. And then whatever the value is on the operation, if you're down, there are different ways to calculate that out to actually come with a quantitative cost on what that means.
Very cool. And then I guess a final question, do you have many fleets or I guess clients working with hydrogen, looking at that as a resilience source of backup power?
The simple answer is yes. I can tell you right now, I have seen the most momentum around hydrogen than I've seen in the 15 years I've been involved. It's
That's awesome.
it's a whole nother discussion. I've got some other webinars coming up where we go into that, but it really is a great complement with electrification and transportation. It's got multiple levels where you can have value of clean energy, resilience, and diversity, diverse transportation options. So.
Very cool. We're at time, but I've got a couple more questions I really want to get through. Rick, I've got a fleet asking, how do you weigh the choice between installing a DC fast charger for your operations versus a level 2, or even maybe for some operations looking at a level 1 versus a level 2? How you judge your operations to make those decisions?
Yeah, so you at least need to have level 2 charging there, obviously, and depending upon the makeup of your fleet, making sure that level 2 can power up a vehicle as fast as that vehicle can charge up at what it can support. As far as quick charging, if you looked at Sarah's example, there's like a couple times this one vehicle, needed to go further or used more energy, even though it didn't travel the miles much. It's really going to depend on turnover. If that person's coming back in regularly to be able to, to go in from the business out to a site and then coming back in and going back out and coming back in, if they're regularly doing that, and that vehicle might need to charge up in a short period of time to be able to continue to serve that need, then you'd want to think about having some quick charging. And so I think that's probably the biggest thing to think about is, the use case for those vehicles. And, if a quick charger is going to make sense to, solve that need, it's a quite a bit more expensive project. Requires more power and it'll have more demand charges. But, if you have that happening regularly where people are in and out a lot, then that would, make sense to have that quick charging as an option, even though it might not be used very much. And you could go with a 24 kW quick charger, which is still charging, faster than they can normally charge on level 2 charging. Sometimes twice as fast, depending upon the vehicle. But, just thinking about, the use case for the vehicles and if you see that need.
Understood. Sarah, did you want to expand on that as well?
Yeah, Rick is spot on. It's understanding what those vehicles need. But I thought it might be helpful to talk a little bit about what we've seen when we've looked at fleets. When I'm going to talk specifically about public sector fleets, we see a big difference in the amount of time they would need to charge at the end of the day when we're looking at state fleets versus when we're looking at municipal or county fleets. This is not surprising. Those municipal and county fleets are often restricted. Restricted might be the wrong word, but they often are constrained to that geography of their municipality, for example. So we don't see those vehicles taking a lot of really long trips. Most of their days are driven within their municipality. We see a lot of vehicles that are good candidates, but only need 1 to 2 hours on level 2 to charge overnight. So if they're coming back to base, they can charge at night really easily with that, particularly with those municipal and county fleets. When we look at state fleets, that's where we see this need, like Rick is talking about, where you have a lot of vehicles that are doing longer trips, they're coming back, and they really need to charge quickly to be used again to go back out. So we see a big difference, and I think that has applied all across the fleets we've looked at. Another thing that we see moving to private sector fleets is whenever you have shift vehicles, this occurs less with many public sector fleets outside of the public safety realm. When you have shift vehicles, we have worked with fleets where their vehicles are really good candidates from an economic standpoint and an operational standpoint, but they are not parked at home long enough to fully charge. And so, like Rick said, in that case, you really want to start looking at, is DC fast charging a good option for us? Does it make financial sense? because then we can move these vehicles into EVs where we expect to see a lot of savings. They're doing a lot of miles every day, but we can get them ready to go and back for that next person who might take it early in the morning, even if it's coming back to the lot late at night.
Very interesting. Thank you. Hey, Rick, I've got one more question for you, and then we'll probably have to wrap. What's your advice on fleets looking at data capable, or some people call it a smart charger, as well as what some would call a dumb charger, which I would maybe characterize as more of a non-data capable, as well as like networking and how that plays in both of those realms?
So I guess there's a couple different things. Most of the network providers, most of the charging equipment providers all have kind of the same functions and features. A lot of that will depend on, what you think you need. As far as, kind of combining that with, a look at, if you're kind of trying to evaluate the few vehicles that you have in your fleet and whether you're going to either need more charging or if you're adding more vehicles to your fleet in the future, you may want to really keep track of what those vehicles are doing now and knowing which cars are charging up and how much they're charging up. If you don't have full data communications on a vehicle, maybe you did a study with, Sarah, and they've said, here's what you should do. You may need to carry that tracking on, and either if you're not tracking it on the vehicle, then tracking on the charger will be necessary. Most people for fleet use don't need the payment mechanism of it, but having a charger that can make sure that you have that data available so you can use that to evaluate what's going on with those vehicles. The other thing is some of the dispatch centers that check out the vehicles, if you don't have tracking on it, they don't know what level of charge that vehicle is at. And so they go, oh, here, go take this car out. Well, you don't know what percentage it's at. And so being able to look at the charging data and be able to go, oh yeah, this car is plugged into that one and it's been there for 3 hours. They can look at that and know that if you have a large fleet where you're checking out different vehicles at different times, and having that information that the vehicle's done charging would be useful information. Or to be able to look when somebody returns their car and brings their stuff back, drops off the keys to you, and being able to look and go, that's not charging right now. Which one did you plug it into? Did you check that? That's a frequent problem when you're starting with new fleets, that you're going to end up checking out a car that doesn't have a full charge on it, and that's going to have dissatisfied users. So that's kind of the main reason for having something that you're getting lots of data from the charging station itself.
Thanks, Rick. I appreciate that. It's a great response. All right, we are definitely at time. I'm going to pass it back to Tammy. Thanks again to all of our speakers. It was a great Q&A session and phenomenal presentations. And thanks again to everyone for attending. Tammy, take it away.
Well, again, thank you to all of our attendees today. We will be sending out a webinar link so you have the full webinar. We will also send out a link for the slides so you can have those for your reference and use. We are looking forward to seeing you all in the next 2 series of our webinars. We'll also be sending out information to give you those exact times and dates. We're very excited to continue this series on electrification and transportation. Again, we'd like to thank our panelists for the wonderful presentation today. And again, all the attendees. I'd also like to thank my colleagues with Long Beach, San Francisco, East Bay Clean Cities, Western Washington Clean Cities, and Columbia Willamette for pulling together this wonderful series. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Bye-bye.